Okay, I've started recording. Thanks, Wes.
Cool. I'll give everybody one more minute to join. Oh, well, we're at 10. So, okay, we're at 10 o'clock Mountain. So welcome, folks. We're excited to have you here. We're excited to be recording this so we could make this available to lots of people. I know I've been working with a number of interns that I'm really excited to have watch this as they on board in the future. So this is great. So we've got Matt Mowers with us. So Matt has, he's got more history on ReEDS than a lot of people do. He was back when the ReEDS team was like 3 people doing stuff. Matt has developed this BokehPivot viewer tool that he'll be talking about that we use to visualize a lot of ReEDS outputs. So I'll turn it over to you, Matt, and you take things away for the next hour here.
Thanks, Wes. Thanks. Yeah, just a little brief on me. Like Wes said, I've actually been working with the ReEDS model since 2008. I was an employee of NREL until 2012. I left NREL to do web development. Worked at Box for a stint for a couple years, and then left in 2016 to kind of start my own independent energy consulting. So that's what I'm doing now, and I've been consulting with the ReEDS team since 2016. In this session, we're going to be discussing BokehPivot. It's a tool for post-processing, visualizing, and gathering data from ReEDS runs. I started building this tool in late 2016, I believe. The original goal was visualizing data from multiple different sources, different models, including at the time an older version of ReEDS. And we also have the RPN model that we've integrated with BokehPivot. Eventually, though, BokehPivot was basically just built into the current version of ReEDS, which we were calling ReEDS 2.0 at the time. Now it's just called ReEDS, but you'll see a lot of references to ReEDS 2.0 in BokehPivot itself. Another note, I'm going to be using the open access version of ReEDS. And so you should be able to do, if you have access to the open access version of ReEDS, you should be able to do everything I'm doing in this presentation. I'm going to start kind of where Stuart left off yesterday. Let me share my screen here. Actually, close this for now. We'll relaunch it. So what Stuart showed yesterday was that when ReEDS is run, a folder is created for each ReEDS run, and inside each of these folders, there's an outputs folder, and the outputs folder has a series of CSV files with the outputs, and then it also has these couple directories that have BokehPivot produced reports. There's a HTML file which visualizes a couple of the results. And there's 2 different reports. There's a reduced report that we're looking at now, and then there's a more extensive report. And then in addition to that, there's an Excel file that has the data behind the charts that we see in the HTML, separated into different tabs. So the HTML at the top has some metadata for the run. There's some this dollar year is shown at the top for any cost outputs. There's also discount rate and present value year that are important for our system cost calculations. And I believe var end year is actually not used, so forget about that one. And then there are links to all the different sections of the report. They're just anchor tags to the different sections. Each section has a chart which is using Bokeh, a Python library Bokeh, for visualization. And there are some tools that come with each chart. By default, the box zoom is collected. So if you click and drag a box, you can zoom into a chart. There's also a pan tool to pan around. There's a wheel zoom tool to use your mouse wheel to zoom in and out. There's a save, which will save the PNG of the chart you're looking at. And there's a reset button that returns the chart back to how it started. So that's how each chart's configured. And you can get a sense of, you can see what the configuration is within BokehPivot in this config summary section. So the result indicates the result, the set of files and preprocessing that we do on specific ReEDS results. And then you can set x-axis, y-axis, and x is set to year in this chart, y-axis is set to generation, terawatt hours of generation. Series refers to the colors. So this is a stacked bar chart. The different colors are different series, and we've chosen tech here as the series so that the different bars are different techs. And then we're exploding by scenario, which in this, for this sake, doesn't really matter because when you run ReEDS and it produces this report, it's only for one scenario, but you'll see it makes a difference later on. And then there's a styling change from the defaults here because we're taking 2-year time steps. And so the bar width is set to 1.75. So that's the basics on reports that are automatically generated from ReEDS. So now we're going to get into having a little bit of delay here. Okay, so I'm going to launch BokehPivot here. This is within a ReEDS repo, there's the BokehPivot folder. And within that, you can launch. I'm on Windows, so I'm using this launch.bat. When I do that, you'll notice the call that's made is pretty simple. It's calling Bokeh, and it's using the serve command, which will launch a Bokeh server. And you can launch multiple at the same time as well. You can continue to launch and configure on different tabs. When I launch this, what comes up is, first of all, you'll notice this type selection. This is automatically set to ReEDS 2.0, so it's expecting that the data, the paths that you send it are to ReEDS 2.0 data. But the other option you can see here is CSV. You can put a flat table in CSV format. You can point to that CSV file in this path, and it will allow you to use BokehPivot to visualize that data. We'll just stick with ReEDS 2.0 though. I have some example runs here that are ERCOT only runs. And so the options here for path, this path section are, you can point to a single run folder, path to a single. I'm on Windows, I can do the shift right click to copy as path. So I'm copying as path to this folder. This is just a single run. And when I do that, and I click on this filter scenarios, I can see that it's gathered it's recognized this as a ReEDS run folder. You can actually do multiple different folders as well. If I shift right click on this one now, copy as path, I can put a pipe symbol between them. So I'll paste, put a pipe symbol. And if I do that, now I have these two folders. Another option is to actually just point to a folder that contains ReEDS run folders. So I'm going to copy his path on the actual runs folder. And that will pull in the 3 scenarios that are in that runs folder. And finally, for the most kind of control over scenarios and what scenarios we're pointing at, the final option is to actually make a CSV file that has data for each ReEDS, the path to each ReEDS run folder, and a display name. And this is in the BokehPivot in directory. You can see this example ReEDS scenarios file. And let me just copy and paste that somewhere else here. I've actually done it here, but delete the previous one. So inside this file is an example of how you would point to different ReEDS scenarios with a file like this. So yeah, let me just alter this for the 3 runs we're talking about. It's just 3 runs, so I'm going to delete that. I'm going to color the first run. This is the color that's associated when the scenario is colored, is a series basically in one of your charts. I'm going to copy all of these runs. Actually, I can select them all and then shift right click and copy as path and paste here, and it will paste them all in. And I've got different colors for each scenario. This one, and now we can name these scenarios better for display names. This is an advanced PV cost. This is a conservative PV cost case. So I'm going to save that and saved it. Go back up a level. This can be named whatever we want it to be. So, for instance, just call it scenarios. And I'm going to shift right click on that, copy as path, and now put it in here. And you can see that it now pulls in the display name is being used now. And also the ordering that I had in that file now matters. And so that's just helpful for building reports and showing results with different kind of names and ordering than are in the run folders themselves. So now we're going to get into building reports from a set of runs. I'm going to just start. You can launch multiple of these at the same time. It launches separate processes. This first drop down here allows you to select the type of report you want to run. We were looking at a reduced report. Let's just do that. But now it's going to be, combining the data from multiple different scenarios. So I'm going to select standard report reduced. For now, I will not add differences. And then I'll just launch this. And this will kick off this separate process, which is invoking BokehPivot without running any server. This is how we can just call Bokeh from a ReEDS run as well. Call BokehPivot from a ReEDS run to produce the reports. There's a kind of code interface that you can use instead of using this interactive interface that requires the server. So you can see from that I've produced now results that have the different cases. In this case, these are ERCOT runs, like I said, and I'm changing the cost of photovoltaics. Now I can add a difference report for this as well. So let's do that. And while that's running, I'm just going to launch a larger report, standard report. And in this case, I'm going to use this build separate reports button that will actually have a different result, one HTML file per result. And then a separate HTML file that allows us to link to those results. So I'll demo that here. I'll do it without differences, just so it's faster. And do this build separate reports. So this is the first report we had built. It didn't have any differences. It was just all the results from the 3 runs. This is the second one I built. Now it has difference plots as well that take a difference to a specified reference scenario. In this case, I selected reference as that scenario. So that's the base case for differences, which is nice. So it'll have a chart for every other scenario that takes the difference with the reference scenario for each of these sections. And then this last process, when you build reports or when you export anything from Bokeh, they will go into the BokehPivot out folder. So I'm going to go into there and show, you can see the path to this file as in BokehPivot out, and it's going to have your username on your machine, and then a report folder is generated there. So that's how to actually access those files. This last one I built here should be the one that every section of the report is a separate file. This is helpful if you have reports that have very many sections, or you're running the reports for many scenarios, which will put a lot of charts in a single HTML file, and it takes a really long time to load if all of these were in the same HTML file. So I'm going to go to the contents file here to show you that you can just, these are links to the other HTML files. So let's look at a map. So I just linked to a result that has a map right now of ReEDS regions, and this is just an ERCOT run, so this is why it's just showing is wind capacity by resource region here. And you can control click to open any of these in new tabs, which allows you to just kind of open them all up and then to take a look at them. So that is a brief on using this kind of report building. I'll get into the custom piece of this in a second, or a few minutes, I guess. But we'll move on now to using the interface to more interactively show results. And these two things are actually linked in the build report. Let me just bring one of these up again here. These two are linked because they're using the same kind of configuration. If you're in the interface, you are configuring these by hand, x-axis, y-axis series. But in a report, these are kind of specified in code. But it's just like I've gone into the interface and I have configured these by hand. In this case, this result, this was the selection of all the configuration options. So let me get into that. Let me use that same result. This result was generation national, but actually Alt, by the way, Alt, if you press Alt, it'll collapse all the drop downs. So that's helpful. Also annoying if you don't want them collapsed and you're pressing Alt. But in the result section here, I'm going to select, so that result was generation national. To show you some kind of different data, I'm going to select generation BA. So this will be still disaggregated generation data by BA. And when I select a result, what happens is that BokehPivot goes to each run that I've selected in filter scenarios. BokehPivot will go to each of those run paths. It will gather the data for this specific result, and it will combine it all across all scenarios into just one flat table, one data frame. And you can see what that looks like if you just at this stage, before I've configured any x-axis, y-axis, or anything like that, if I just download the full data source, this download export dropdown, I can download the full data source, and you can see the flat table that BokehPivot produced with scenario as a column in this table and all the other columns. And one other thing that BokehPivot's doing, as you can see, is whereas the raw data is at the balancing area level, that's this RB here, this would be the raw data essentially coming out of ReEDS. It could be pre-processed or scaled and that type of thing. But these columns are actually columns that have been joined on to allow different regional aggregations of the BA data. In this case, we're running only ERCOT, so there's only one state, Texas. But this would allow you then to use these different regional aggregations in the interface. So that's what happens when you pull a result before any configuration is made. The next thing here is this presets dropdown, and this has different presets that we've allowed or that we've added for the for each result. And there's going to be a different set of presets depending on the result you use. Actually, one note I forgot on result. The results are not all functional. So I'm going to show you where the reports are, and the results that we have in reports are typically the ones that have been double checked the most. Some of these results are still very functional and we use them. Some of them might be outdated, haven't been maintained, and they might be broken. So just keep that in mind. There's a lot of results here. The ones that we include in our reports are kind of the ones that we check more often. In any case, I'm going to select a preset now, and the preset consists of a configuration. So let me just select stacked bars, or let me do stacked area just so it's different than what you've seen. Okay, so this is a stacked area chart showing the generation. And right now, if we go down to the bottom here, there's a legend that is in a drop down that shows you what the colors correspond to. You can also hover to see what these different technologies are. And below that is a config summary, and you can see what this preset did. it set the x-axis to year, the y-axis to generation, the series or the colors to tech, and then it exploded by scenario. That was this, that's what this preset corresponded to, was a preset configuration. But now we can manually change anything we want. And this is something we could have done before we selected a preset. We can manually set all these configuration options. So I can change chart type to bar. This is more like the one we were seeing in the reports. But you'll see that there was an additional configuration option in reports that was setting the bar width to 1.75. So this, so that changes in this plot adjustments section here, where I can change the visual, just the styling of the chart some. Bar width is down here. So I could change it to let's just do 1.9. So it'll look, a little more like what's in the report. And then I can change any of these others. X-axis you can see has been selected as year. Y-axis is generation. The series is tech. The explode tells us what different dimensions to turn into separate charts. What I'll do right now actually is I'm going to, since we've drawn in generation by BA, we can now use that as, let's say, another explode dimension. And so I'll do that now. First of all, filters allows us to just filter down to, let's say, we can, right now I'll filter to just 2020 and beyond. We often do that. And you have to click the update. For the filters, you have to click the update filters option for the update to take effect. A lot of the other widgets automatically update, although you can also disable that update feature in this section here. If you're making a lot of changes and you don't want it to take so long after each change, you can make all the changes at once by disabling the auto update, and then you can click this manual update button to run all those changes at once. So I've selected year. Let's the balancing areas. Let's just select a couple balancing areas here and filter it. These are different balancing areas in ERCOT. I don't know specifically where they are, but and then we can also add like another explode dimension. And since I've, selected the BA option, let's just explode by BA. And I've reduced it down to 2 BAs, so it should be reasonable. Another thing you should note about explode is you can kind of turn this into a grid. So if I make it a grid plot here, now it's got the rows are the balancing areas, the columns are the scenarios. So these are the two balancing areas that I selected in filters because I filtered that down. So that's kind of how, and then let's actually, one more thing I'll show you in this section is this operations. This operations drop down, these configuration options are what allows us to take differences across scenarios and that type of thing. So in this case, yeah, I'll show a difference and we'll take it across scenario and you can see how that works. And in this, let me actually demo this, just disabling the update so that I can make these different changes all at once and then run a manual update. So I'm going to take a difference. I'm going to operate across scenario in this case. and you select a base. My base is going to be a reference. You can see that there's some other interesting ones, total and consecutive here. Total would take a difference with the sum across scenarios. This is more important if we're, instead of using difference, we're doing like a ratio. For example, if you want to do something like generation fraction, that would be using a ratio operation operating across technology and then having the base be total. So actually, let's just do that. Let's just select that as another example. Operate across tech, and the base is, and you'll notice that the base depends on what you're operating across. And I'll select total here. And then I'll run a manual update. Okay, so now we have a generation fraction charts. Generation fraction charts for each of these two BAs and for each scenario. And you can see all the configuration that I've made down here. This is basically all the non-default configuration is shown in this config summary. I think that's good for operations. I'm going to get into now, so I've talked about adjustments. Let's just do one more, just adjustment, just to show you what can be done. So, I mean, you can change plot width, for example, plot height. And by the way, the reason this isn't updating is that I have this set to disable. Let's enable it now again, and let's run a manual update. So now I've changed like plot width, plot height. Now I'm going to export what I've configured. So this is for sharing it with others. This is also for me being able to reuse this configuration and apply it to different runs potentially. To add this configuration to reports, I can make this a section of a report. And so there's a few different buttons here for downloading either configuration or data. This button at the bottom we've already looked at, and that just that doesn't refer to any of this configuration. That's just the result. The result, when we selected the result, this is the full table that was produced. And then these, though, you can see view at the end of all of these buttons. So this is full data source. These are all aspects of the view that we're looking at right now. I'll just click all files of view, which will download a CSV of data for this view. It'll download an HTML for this view, a URL for this view, which allows me to actually load this page again. A Python report of view, which is the configuration that I've set here and I'll show you that. A preset of view, which actually you won't need to use as much, so we don't need to cover that. And so let me just do that. So I just downloaded all files of view. When I do that, it refreshes here, I can see that in my view, in this folder was created. This is the view folder, and it's all of these files that I was just talking about, the HTML, the CSV of view. So let me just open the HTML. Okay, so this is the configuration that we set, except it's including the legend here. By the way, when we made a grid plot, the tools are just in one location for the full grid plot. And now I can send this HTML to anyone else, and they can look at this data, and they can have, hover over the data and see it. All of this is self-contained, and this is just a way that we often share data with our clients. So that's the view. That's the HTML of the view. The CSV of the view has only the data that is used in the view. So it's been aggregated to whatever level that the view is aggregated. And that's actually one piece. The aggregation piece is one piece I skipped over before. That comes from the y-axis. The default aggregation is to sum across all the values. So this is kind of similar to Excel pivot charts, how they work. But there's other aggregation levels that do. In any case, the view.csv should show exactly the same data that is shown in the HTML file, and no more and no less. So that's it for creating a downloading a view and exporting it. One thing I did have a note to go over was to actually just relaunch this to show that you can launch kind of multiple sessions of BokehPivot, and then to use this URL that was created from the view. So let me go into the view folder itself, the view output. One of these is this URL file, and you'll see that it says paste this after /BokehPivot in the URL. So it's been encoded, characters that have been converted. And I just selected that entire line, and I'm going to paste it after BokehPivot here. And it should do everything. It should go pull the scenarios, if it's working correctly, pull the scenarios, configure the charts, and now we have another BokehPivot interface working where we can further make adjustments and filter. Note here, there's a scenario filter that I haven't talked about yet. And this is, it may look like it's duplicating this filter scenarios. Filter scenarios is actually is a filtering step before the data has been gathered from ReEDS runs. So it means it allows you to only gather data in the first place from certain runs that you select here or deselect. And so the scenario filter here, though, is after all that data has been gathered into this one table. Now we can further deselect scenarios and create our views. So, but I just deselected the conservative PV cost case here. So that's it on, I think, exporting and the URL to reinvoke the same BokehPivot session. The next thing I want to get into is the custom reports. So in this output, when we outputted all the files of the view, you'll notice that there's this report.py file. And report.py has, again, just shows all the configuration that we've made, and including all the styling changes, plot width, plot height, bar width, and so on. All the filters we've applied, absolutely all the configuration is included in this. But this format actually allows us to use this as a section of a report. So the first thing I'm going to do, and And that's important because we can launch the reports like we did at the beginning of this session. So it's using the custom. Let's just get in here and look at this, this build report section again, which you can basically view as working independently of this result section below and the BokehPivot view. All this report building will launch separate processes. So we did this before and we ran some standard report reduced. I'm going to leave it at custom here. And if it's custom, we need a path to the file. And this is what we created when we getting a little delay here again. Okay. Copy his path here for this report file. I'll enter it here. And now I can, refilter these scenarios to see what I want it to apply to. In this case, let me just leave all three. And let me build the report. So now it's created a report with this section, and I can rename this section. See, it just says section name right now. That's because it says section name here. So this is Gen Track BA for these select couple BAs in this case. So that's the name of this section. And let me just show you how you can start building a custom report in this way. So this actually is a just one section of a report, this entire string. It's not formatted, it's just all on one line. But there's a comma at the end, and it's within this Python list. So this is just a list of different section reports. I'm going to go now to this is the BokehPivot. Let me actually do it in the Explorer. I think that'll be easier to see. If you're in BokehPivot, if you go into Reports, Templates, into ReEDS 2, these are the different reports we had to select from in the interface. So I'll just show you that. Sorry, this is actually, oh, it's fine. So these are the different reports that it pulled from the kind of pre-configured reports. But now I'm going to steal some sections from those reports and add it to our custom report that we have right here and show you that how you can build up a custom report. So let me just open. This is what the Python file looks like for standard report reduced.py. So these are the different sections of the report. They're named. There's a result given, that gets all the data from the different runs. And then in this case, there's a preset key that is used, and that has the preset configuration. And the preset configurations, if you want to dig into those, and the definition and logic behind the results and the pre-processing is all within the BokehPivot ReEDS 2.py. So if I look for one of these results, for example, Generation National, this is configured in ReEDS 2.py as a combination of different file, different sources. These files are actually the CSV files in the output folder. And then there's pre-processing that's done on each of these CSV files. And then the presets are determined, are shown here. These are the different preset names. This is the configuration associated with each preset. So the stacked bars, the x-axis was set to year, y-axis was set to generation, and so on. So that allows us in the reports to just say just use that preset key to load the full configuration. And that's what's happening here. Let me just copy one of these. Let's say new annual capacity. In this case, it doesn't really matter which one I'm copying, just so that I can show you that I can just build up. Just make sure there's still a comma there. Yep. I can build up different sections of a custom report this way. The first section is what we output from the interface. That's the view we output from the interface. And that uses this config key. And the config key needs to be given the full list of configuration that's needed for that section of the report. But you'll see the second one, as I said, it can use this preset key, which is some preset configurations that we have set in ReEDS2.py. But if I save this, now if I run it, maybe it was this version of BokehPivot where I loaded the custom report. Okay. Yes, it was this version of BokehPivot. The custom report path is here. And now when I click build report, it should have these two separate sections now that I've saved that file. So now you're looking at generation fraction by BA being this one that we configured, and there's this separate section that is new annual capacity. And this is how you can just flexibly and easily create your own report, your own set of sections that you can then apply to any other runs that are made. And so that's how this kind of custom report building is done. I'm actually a little bit ahead of time. Wes, do you think just the beginning of debugging maybe, or is there anything to clarify at this point?
Yeah, so first let's say if folks have questions, you're welcome to throw them in terms of what pieces are there. I think, Matt, one of the things that would be helpful for me is you may look at a result and say, where does this come from in ReEDS? Could you talk a little bit about saying, I'm looking at this thing in a report. Where is this coming out of the model?
Right. Okay. There's this process that you can go through to just kind of trace back where it's coming from. So, and to tell me, Wes, if I'm off base with what your question was, but basically where I would start is looking at the report file itself if you're using a report. So if you're using standard report reduced, for example, the first step is to look at that Python file, look at the result name here, and then what I would do is I would go in, and this is the preset, but the result is what's connected to what's coming out of ReEDS. So I would just copy this result value here, go to ReEDS2.py, and I would search for it. And you can see we already searched for the same one. This will have the configuration, and it will tell you the files that are being used in each ReEDS run. So let me go in. This is using the gen_an.csv from each of these ReEDS runs. So let me just go into any one of these reads runs. Outputs gen_an.csv is going to be a CSV that exists in this outputs folder. And if I open it up, I can see the raw data from gen_an. And so that's how to connect the result to the files that are coming out of ReEDS. Now, what then happens in BokehPivot after it grabs the files is it does some pre-processing on that result. And those functions are in this same reeds2.py file. This sum over calls preprocess I'm dropping, because it's a national generation result, I want to drop the regional detail. And this runs it's in this function. This function is in this reeds2.py, and these are the preprocess functions that happen before the initial data frame that Bokeh that we can then pivot on is created. Any more on that, Wes?
I think that's good. I think another common thing that's going to come up too is, what if you want to change colors or change the technology aggregation? Like, what if you want to lump all batteries instead of having battery 2, 4, 6, 8? Or what if you want to break out technologies in more detail than we have them broken out in the plots?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Wes, on that. Yeah, I forgot about that. An important section in this file, before I leave it for what Wes is talking about here, is it's part of the pre-process. These column names that are listed here, some of them are special names. Actually, all of these probably are. If you use a name of tech here, this is assigning the data we get from the CSV. This assigns it labels the columns like this from that data. So that's the kind of first step that happens. If a column is called tech, there is a section here within reeds2.py that is called columns_meta. And columns_meta says for a column named tech, it's the first one. For the column named tech, there is a mapping file that is applied as a pre-process step, and there's a styling file. So Wes is talking about if you wanted to change, for example, ReEDS has all these technology names, but I want to aggregate them into a certain display name. That's in the mapping file. And then the styling file refers to like the colors that you give those different technologies. So let's just look at those here in BokehPivot. This is where the location is in ReEDS2, and then tech map and tech style. Just open those. This is the tech map right here. And tech map is very simple mapping. The left is unique indicators, and the right is a display name that so the left is what comes out of ReEDS, the technology names that come out of ReEDS. And then the right is what we want to call them. What we want to not just call, but like we'll aggregate the data as well from these multiple ReEDS texts into these display names. So that's this mapping file. So if you wanted to change, for instance, right now we're mapping, we have kind of a one-to-one mapping for the battery technologies here from ReEDS. But if we wanted to just call them all battery in the interface, we would just, be able to do that here. And now, if I were to save this file and rerun say the standard report. Yeah, let's just rerun the standard. Actually, this one's probably has the standard reduced report here. And then I build it. Now the batteries should no longer be separated into the different hours. Those numbers were the hours of storage. But with this mapping file change, I can now have battery be just one entry here. So the capacity, yeah, this is just the full battery capacity. So that's kind of how to do remapping. And then the styling here says for each of these display names, this is the color. So you can use a different hex color if you want to style them differently. I've made the changes directly to the files that are in the repo. You can also point to, via the interface, you can decide to point to different mapping files as well. But this is kind of the easiest way to do it. So, Wes, any more on that?
I think that's great.
Okay.
I think the other, let's see, two other pieces. One is a discount rate change, just because people might want to use a different discount rate, and that's pretty easy. And then the second piece, I don't know if you want to try right now or not, but there's some outputs that are less obvious in terms of what they are. I'm thinking of like the electricity price, the bulk power system price, that are, it's like you could look at the output and you could even look at where they come from, but it's not intuitive necessarily what's happening. So I don't know if you want to try and hit one of those in the next 4 minutes, or if you just want to call it good. But you can start with the discount rate, because that's a pretty simple one.
Yeah, the discount rate, and there's actually a nuance here that's going to be pretty annoying, I think, for people that want to launch reports via the interface. The issue is that it's not actually, if you update these, let me actually give it a try, unless this has been fixed. Let me update a discount rate and then relaunch the standard report reduced here. Because I think that, you know, where those should apply to these reports, but they may just apply in the interface. So let me even see if, and I think that for report's sake, yeah, okay, so I had changed the discount rate, but it didn't actually change when you launch a report. So the reports actually aren't linked to those inputs properly yet. You can go into the code and change that. But what it really allows you to do, those variables allow you to use the interface and have the interface reflect. So let me just go to system cost here. Syscost, I believe annualized is the one we have in our report. And then total discounted. So this is total discounted costs. And when I update this is another, did I update it already? 0.5. I did, but let's say, okay, let's pay attention to this number here. This is, I think the other issue is it won't update the chart data interactively because the discount rate is actually gets applied when the result is drawn in. So it's another annoyance, is that I have to change the discount rate and then I have to draw the result in again. So let's just look at this number, 442 here. Let's make the discount rate 0.08. That's a change. And now I have to draw the result in again. So to do that, well, actually, I think it maybe just did it. It was 442. Now it's 398.366. So when I made the change, okay, so I guess that it's better than I said. you make that change, it did notice that it needed to draw the result back in again, but it wiped out all the other configuration I had. So that's how to change kind of a discount rate. But like I said, in the reports, it won't respond to what you have here as discount rate. You actually, in a report, will have to specify the discount rate that you're using. Let me go to the custom report here. So this configuration here, I would have to actually add the key for the discount rate. And let me see if it exports at least. Our discount rate it's been tracked here as a change. So that's good. Let me export a Python report of view. So I can show you that if I do that, I have this var discount rate that's been exported. And now this is showing you how you would apply a different discount rate to a section of a report. So it can be done in reports. And that is within this, you can see it's within the config. So if I wanted to change this one, I could put this as another kind of config option. So you can use the interface to export the configuration you need to build a report with that change. Wes, any more on that? Was that clear?
No, I think we're good, and we're at time here, so I think we better close out. I'll just remind folks that if you have other questions or comments or thoughts on things, you're welcome to visit the GitHub discussion page and post things there, and we can respond to them. Or if you see issues or you find something broken, you're welcome to put an issue in on the repo, and then we could take care of it there. So thanks, Matt. This has been really good. Thanks. Glad to be part of this.
Thanks so much.
So Matt, on your end, you'll need to hit stop recording as the host.
Okay. Let me just stop sharing here. Okay. Stop recording. Yeah.